Alrighty, Rooney, welcome back to Free Read Fridays. Oh, hello, Warren. Thanks for tuning in to Free Read Fridays. And yeah, so y'all ready? We are transitioning to the Fall of Hyperion, the second book in the Hyperion Cantos. And we're going to have a bit of an abrupt change of pace here. We're going to have actual chapters for starters, and quite a few of them. Some new faces, some not so new faces. Uh, some we've been introduced to before, and some we've maybe heard the name of at best. I think we've heard the name of Morpurgo before now, but I'm not absolutely certain. He might have been referenced. Um, we're going to get to know that character a little better, but not a massive amount better this time round. Um, yeah, so previously on, they were off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Because of the wonderful things he does. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Um, and our gang of pilgrims was off. They were off to the time tombs and the Sphinx, following the person that might be speaker for the World Tree Yggdrasil, um, Het Mastine. I wonder if they'll find him. Things we'll find out today. Possibly. Possibly answers to some questions today, or just new questions. We'll find out. Alrighty, I'm gonna get cracking. Um, Sit back, relax, enjoy your time, and yeah, time for The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. It's gonna be a good time. Um, the conclusion is pretty crazy. Things start happening very, very quickly. At first, it seems like they're just kind of meandering and stalling, and then it's like, oh wait, no, that was all fairly important. And then the climax starts ramping up, and you're like, oh boy, I don't know if I'm ready. And then it hits, and you're like, I was definitely not ready. Things are like, I don't know how I'm gonna get through the last two parts of this because it's like my heart rate's gonna explode. I'm gonna get really into it. It's gonna be awesome. Don't have to worry about that today, probably, unless I start having a massive heart failure or a stroke or something, which is unlikely at this stage. Um, he said optimistically, knowing that the Technocore had implanted the bombs in his head, not knowing when he walked through the wormholes. I should have known. I should have known. I don't think they can do that, so I think I'm fine. Anyway, we'll get rolling. That's enough blather. Any other salient details? Oh yeah, we learned that last time. Massive spoilers for last time if you haven't listened to it yet. Massive, truly, truly massive spoilers. The consul is a traitor to the hegemony. He's also a traitor to the ousters who he betrayed the hegemony to. He's honestly just generally traitorous, but the reasons for his treason are extremely reasonable, considering. Um, Last time was when we learned that the hegemony really is not all it's cracked up to be. The cracks were there. We could see the cracks. Any society that has the massive stratification that one did, uh, pretty clear there's probably, something probably stinks there. And last time we got pretty solid confirmation of that. Compared to today, are people's standard of living much higher? Probably. Um, but the only reason that their civilization hasn't collapsed is because they've had effectively unlimited room to expand. Um, so if they were locked on a planet, it'd be dead. Oh wait, it is. Uh, sort of, kind of, maybe. I'm still not 100% sure if the Earth that Keats was on, Cybrid Keats was on, was actual factual Earth. Um, or if it was a complete replica. They sort of say it is a duplicate, and then they're like, well, no, it's just a replica. Or they imply that they might have moved it, and then they're like, well, maybe not. Because it's the different characters, I guess, pitching. Um, I'll have to double check and see if any more official sources confirm that it is in fact the OG Earth, or if it was in fact eaten by black hole, and then I don't know. I don't know how they would perform that bait and switch, but this is the technocore we're talking about, and they're rather tricky. And we are going to learn just how tricky um, in this volume. Things are not quite what they seem on that score, and we thought they were pretty We learned they were pretty complicated, and things are rather more interesting as it turns out. I'm not spoiling anything when I say that. Um, Things are pretty wild, and you're going to learn how certain pieces of the story that the world link together in ways that you didn't really think could happen. Um, but do make sense in context. Alrighty, that's enough blather. We're going to get cracking. I'm still a little under the gun from the COVID inoculation, but I'm better now. So it's going to be a shorter one this time. It's not going to be as short as last time, probably, but um, it's not going to be like a 3-4 hour affair, is what I'm saying. So sit back, relax, and stop listening to me blather, and instead listen to Dan Simmons uh, compose. The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. To John Keats, whose name was writ in eternity. Can God play a significant game with his own creature? Can any creator, even a limited one, play a significant game with his own creature? Norbert Wiener, God and Golem Incorporated. May there not be superior beings amused with any graceful, though instinctive attitude my mind may fall into, as I am entertained with the alertness of a stoat or the anxiety of a deer? Though a quarrel in the streets is a thing to be hated, the energies displayed in it are fine. By a superior being our reasonings may take the same tone, though erroneous they may be fine. This is the very thing which consists This is the very thing in which consists poetry. John Keats in a letter to his brother. The imagination may be compared to Adam's dream. He awoke and found it truth. John Keats in a letter to a friend. Part 1. Chapter 1. On the day the Armada went off to war, on the last day of life as we knew it, I was invited to a party. There were parties everywhere that evening, on more than 150 worlds in the web, but this was the only party that mattered. I signified acceptance via the datasphere, checked to make sure that my finest formal jacket was clean, took my time bathing and shaving, dressed with meticulous care, and used the one-time disk key in the invitation chip to farcast from Esperance to Tau Ceti Center at the appointed time. It was evening in this hemisphere of TC squared, and a low, rich light illuminated the hills and vales of Deer Park, the grey towers of the administration complex far to the south, the weeping willows and radiant fern-fire which lined the banks of River Tethys, and the white colonnades of Government House itself. Thousands of guests were arriving, but security personnel greeted each of us, checked our invitation codes against DNA patterns, and showed the way to bar and buffet with a graceful gesture of arm and hand. M. Joseph Severn? The guide confirmed politely. Yes, I lied. It was now my name, but never my identity. CEO Gladstone still wishes to see you later in the evening. You will be notified when she is free for the appointment. Very good. If you desire anything in the way of refreshment or entertainment that is not set out, merely speak your wish aloud, and the grounds monitors will seek to provide it. I nodded, smiled, and left the guide behind. Before I had strolled a dozen steps, he had turned to the next guests alighting from the Terminex platform. From my vantage point on a low knoll, I could see several thousand guests milling across several hundred acres of manicured lawn, many of them wandering among forests of topiary. Above the stretch of grass where I stood, its broad sweep already shaded by the line of trees along the river, lay the formal gardens, and beyond them rose the imposing bulk of Government House. A band was playing on the distant patio, and hidden speakers carried the sound to the farthest reaches of Deer Park. A constant line of EMVs spiraled down from a Farcaster portal far above. For a few seconds I watched their brightly clad messengers disembark at the platform near the pedestrian terminex. I was fascinated by the variety of aircraft. Evening light glinted not only on the shells of the standard Vikings and Alts and Sumatsos, but also on the rococo decks of levitation barges and the metal hulls of antique skimmers, which had been quaint when old Earth still existed. I wandered down the long, gradual slope to the River Tethys, past the dock where an incredible assortment of rivercraft disgorged their passengers. The Tethys was the only web-wide river, flowing past its permanent Farcaster portals through the sections of more than 200 worlds and moons, and the folk who lived along its banks were some of the wealthiest in the hegemony. The vehicles on the river showed this. Great crenellated cruisers, canvas-laden barks, and five-tiered barges, many showing signs of being equipped with levitation gear, elaborate houseboats, obviously fitted with their own Farcasters, small motile isles imported from the oceans of Maui Covenant, sporty pre-Hedgera speedboats and submersibles, an assortment of hand-carved nautical EMVs from Renaissance Vector, and a few contemporary go-everywhere yachts, their outlines hidden by the seamless reflective ovoid surfaces of containment fields. The guests who alighted from these craft were no less flamboyant and impressive than their vehicles. Personal styles ranged from pre-Hedgera conservative evening wear, on bodies obviously never touched by Paulson treatments, to this week's highest fashion from TC², draped on figures moulded by the web's most famous artists. Then I moved on, pausing at a long table just long enough to fill my plate with roast beef, salad, sky squid fillet, Parvati curry, and fresh-baked bread. The low evening light had faded to twilight by the time I found a place to sit near the gardens, and the stars were coming out. The lights of the nearby city and administration complex had been dimmed for tonight's viewing of the Armada, and Tau Ceti Center's night sky was more clear than it had been for centuries. A woman near me glanced over and smiled. I'm sure that we have met before. I smiled back, sure that we had not. She was very attractive, perhaps twice my age, in her late 50s, standard, but looking younger than my own 26 years, thanks to money and Paulson. Her skin was so fair that it looked almost translucent. Her hair was done in a rising braid. Her breasts, more revealed than hidden by the wispware gown, were flawless. Her eyes were cruel. Perhaps we have, I said, although it seems unlikely. My name is Joseph Severn. Severn. Of course, she said. You're an artist. I was not an artist. I had been, a poet. But the Severn identity, which I had inhabited since my real persona's death and birth a year before, stated that I was an artist. It was in my all-thing file. "I remembered," laughed the lady. She lied. She had used her expensive Comlog implants to access the datasphere. I did not need to access, a clumsy, redundant word which I despise despite its antiquity. I mentally closed my eyes and was in the datasphere, sliding past the superficial all-thing barriers, slipping beneath the waves of surface data, and following the glowing strand of her access umbilical far into the darkened depths of secure information flow.
"My name is Diana Philomel," she said. "My husband is Sector Transport Administrator for Sol.2-Ch.5."
I nodded and took the hand she offered. She had said nothing about the fact that her husband had been head goon for the Mold Scrubbers Union on Heaven's Gate before political patronage had promoted him to Sol Draconi, or that her name had once been Danae Teets. Danae Teets, former crib doxy and hop-stop hostess to lung-pipe proxies in the Mid-Sump Barrens, or that she had been arrested twice for flashback abuse, the second time seriously injuring a halfway house medic, or that she had poisoned her half-brother when she was 9, after he had threatened to tell her stepfather that she was seeing a mudflat miner named... "Pleased to meet you, M. Philomel," I said. Her hand was warm. She held the handshake an instant too long.
"Isn't it exciting?"
She breathed. "What's that?" She made an expansive gesture that included the night, the glowing globes just coming on, the gardens, and the crowds.
"Oh, the party, the war, everything," she said.
I smiled, nodded, and tasted the roast beef. It was rare and quite good, but gave the salty hint of the Lucis clone vats. The squid seemed authentic. Stewards had come by offering champagne, and I tried mine. It was inferior. Quality wine, Scotch, and coffee had been the 3 irreplaceable commodities after the death of old Earth. "Do you think the war is necessary?" I asked.
Goddamn right it's necessary.
Sorry.
Goddamn right it's necessary.
Diana Philomel had opened her mouth, but it was her husband who answered. He had come up from behind, and now took a seat on the faux log where we dined. He was a big man, at least 1.5 feet taller than I. But then, I am short. My memory tells me that I once wrote a verse ridiculing myself as Mr. John Keats, 5 feet high. Although I am 5'1", slightly short when Napoleon and Wellington were alive, and the average height for men was 5'6", ridiculously short now that men from average G worlds range from 6 feet tall to almost 7. I obviously did not have the musculature or frame to claim that I had come from a high G world, so to all eyes I was merely short. I report my thoughts above in the units in which I think. Of all the mental changes since my rebirth into the web, thinking in metric is by far the hardest. Sometimes I refuse to try. Why is the war necessary? Why is the war necessary? I asked Herman Philomel, Diana's husband.
Because they goddamn asked for it,
Growled the big man. He was a molar grinder and a cheek muscle flexor. He had almost no neck and a subcutaneous beard that obviously defied depilatory, blade, and shaver. His hands were half again as large as mine and many times more powerful. I see, I said.
The goddamn ousters goddamn asked for it,
He repeated, reviewing the high points of his argument for me.
They fucked with us on Brescia, and now they're fucking with us what's this?
"Hyperion system,"
said his wife, her eyes never leaving mine.
Yeah,
Said her lord and husband.
Hyperion system. They fuck with us, and now we've got to go out there and show them that the hegemony isn't going to stand for it. Understand?
Memory told me that as a boy I had been sent off to John Clark's academy at Enfield, and that there had been more than a few small-brained, ham-fisted bullies like this there. When I first arrived, I avoided them or placated them. After my mother died, after the world changed, I went after them with rocks in my small fists, and rose from the ground to swing again, even after they had bloodied my nose and loosened my teeth with their blows. I understand, I said softly. My plate was empty. I raised the last of my bad champagne to toast Diana Philomel.
Draw me, she said.
I beg your pardon?
Draw me, M7. You're an artist.
A painter, I said, making a helpless gesture with an empty hand. I'm afraid I have no stylus. Diana Philomel reached into her husband's tunic pocket and handed me a light pen.
Draw me, please.
I drew her. The portrait took shape in the air between us, lines rising and falling and turning back on themselves like neon filaments in a wire sculpture. A small crowd gathered to watch. Mild applause rippled when I finished. The drawing was not bad. It caught the lady's long, voluptuous curve of neck, high braid bridge of hair, prominent cheekbones, even the slight, ambiguous glint of eye. It was as good as I could do after the RNA medication and lessons had prepared me for the persona. The real Joseph Seven could do better, had done better. I remember him sketching me as I lay dying. M. Diana Philomel beamed approval. M. Hermond Philomel glowered. A shout went up. "There they are!" The crowd murmured, gasped, and hushed. Glow globes and garden lights dimmed and went off. Thousands of guests raised their eyes to the heavens. I erased the drawing and tucked the light pen back in Hermond's tunic. "It's the Armada," said a distinguished-looking older man in force-dress black. He lifted his drink to point something out to his young female companion. "They've just opened the portal. The scouts will come through first, then the torch ship escorts." The Force Military Farcaster portal was not visible from our vantage point. Even in space, I imagine it would look like nothing more than a rectangular aberration in the starfield. But the fusion trails of the scout ships were certainly visible, first as a score of fireflies or radiant gossamers, then as blazing comets as they ignited their main drives and swept out through Tau Ceti Systems' cislunar traffic region. Another cumulative gasp went up as the torch ships farcast into existence, their fire tails 100 times longer than the scouts. TC Square's night sky was scarred from zenith to horizon with gold-red streaks. Somewhere the applause began, and within seconds the fields and lawns and formal gardens of Government House's Deer Park were filled with riotous applause and raucous cheering from the well-dressed crowd of billionaires and government officials and members of noble houses from 100 worlds forgot as... Oh, geez. I got lost in the sentence and completely forgot where I was. Or who I am. Let's take it from the top. Somewhere the applause began, and within seconds the fields and lawns and formal gardens of the Government House's Deer Park were filled with riotous applause and raucous cheering as the well-dressed crowd of billionaires and government officials and members of noble houses from 100 worlds forgot everything except a jingoism and war lust, awakened now after more than a century and a half of dormancy. I did not applaud. Ignored by those around me, I finished my toast, not to Lady Philomel now, but to the enduring stupidity of my race, and downed the last of the champagne. It was flat. Above, the more important ships of the flotilla had translated in system. I knew from the briefest touch of the datasphere, its surface now agitated with surges of information until it resembled a storm-tossed sea, that the main line of the Force Space Armada consisted of more than 100 capital spin ships, matte black attack carriers, looking like thrown spears with their launch arms lashed down. 3C command ships, as beautiful... excuse me. Something's going on in the back of my throat. I'm not sure what. 3 sea command ships, as beautiful and awkward as meteors made of black crystal. Bulbous destroyers resembling the overgrown torch ships they were. Perimeter defense pickets, more energy than matter, their massive containment shields now set to total reflection. Brilliant mirrors reflecting Tau Ceti and the hundreds of flame trails around them. Fast cruisers, moving like sharks among the slower schools of ships. Lumbering troop transports carrying thousands of Force Marines in their zero-G holds. And scores of support ships. Frigates, fast attack fighters, torpedo ALRs, fatline relay pickets, and the Farcaster jump ships themselves, massive dodecahedrons with their fairyland arrays of antennae and probes. All around the fleet, kept at a safe distance by traffic control, flitted the yachts and sunjammers and private in-system ships, their sails catching sunlight and reflecting the glory of the Armada. The guests on the Government House grounds cheered and applauded. The gentleman in Force Black was weeping silently. Nearby, concealed cameras and wideband images carried the moment to every world in the web and, via Fatline, to scores of worlds which were not. I shook my head and remained seated. M7? A security guard stood over me. Yes? She nodded toward the executive mansion. CEO Gladstone will see you now. Chapter 2. Every age fraught with discord and danger seems to... Incidentally, if anybody has an issue with this particular voice, you're going to be hearing a lot of it. So this is an endurance contest for me to see if I can maintain my identity while I read this. It is not going to be the whole book with it, but a huge percentage of it is going to be him. So this is kind of this is going to be a big one for me. Sorry. Had to do that aside. I didn't have to. I could have just not done it and let everyone figure it out. But here we are. Chapter 2. Every age fraught with discord and danger seems to spawn a leader meant only for that age, a political giant whose absence, in retrospect, seems inconceivable when the history of that age is written. Mina Gladstone was just such a leader for our final age, although none then could have dreamed that there would be no one but me to write the true history of her and her time. Gladstone had been compared to the classical figure of Abraham Lincoln so many times that when I was finally ushered into her presence that night of the Armada party, I was half surprised not to find her in a black frock coat and stovepipe hat. The CEO of the Senate and leader of a government serving 130 billion people was wearing a grey suit of soft wool, trousers and tunic top ornamented only by the slightest hint of red cord piping at seams and cuffs. I did not think she looked like Abraham Lincoln, nor like Alvarez Tomp, the second most common hero of antiquity cited as her doppelganger by the press. I thought that she looked like an old lady. Mina Gladstone was tall and thin, but her countenance was more aquiline than Lincolnesque, with her blunt beak of a nose, sharp cheekbones, the wide, expressive mouth with thin lips, and grey hair rising in a roughly cropped wave, which did indeed resemble feathers. But to my mind, the most memorable aspect of Mina Gladstone's appearance was her eyes, large, brown, and infinitely sad. We were not alone. I had not been led into a long... Sorry, I don't know where "not" came from. I had been led, I had indeed. I had been led into a long, softly lighted room, lined with wooden shelves holding many hundreds of printed books. A long hollow frame simulating a window gave a view of the gardens. A meeting was in the process of breaking up, and a dozen men and women stood or sat in a rough half-circle that held Gladstone's desk at its cusp. The CEO leaned back casually on her desk, resting her weight on the front of it, her arms folded. She looked up as I entered.
M7?
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Her voice was familiar from 1,000 all-thing debates, its timbre rough with age, and its tone as smooth as an expensive liqueur. Her accent was famous, blending precise syntax with an almost forgotten lilt of pre-Hedgerer English, evidently now found only in the river-delta regions of her homeworld of Potoffa.
Gentlemen and ladies, let me introduce M. Joseph 7, she said.
Several of the group nodded, obviously at a loss as to why I was there. Gladstone made no further introductions, but I touched the datasphere to identify everyone. 3 cabinet members, including the Minister of Defence, 2 Force Chiefs of Staff, 2 aides to Gladstone, 4 senators, including the influential Senator Kolchev, and a projection of a Technocorps councillor known as Albedo.
M7 has been invited here to bring an artist's perspective to the proceedings, said CEO Gladstone.
Force Ground General Morpurgo Force Ground General Morpurgo snorted a laugh. An artist's perspective? With all due respect, CEO, what the hell does that mean? Gladstone smiled. Instead of answering the general, she turned back to me.
What do you think of the passing of the Armada, M7?
It's pretty, I said. General Morpurgo made a noise again. Pretty? He looks at the greatest concentration of Space Force firepower in the history of the galaxy and calls it pretty? He turned toward another military man and shook his head. Gladstone's smile had not wavered.
And what of the war? She asked me. Do you have an opinion on our attempt to rescue Hyperion from the ouster barbarians?
It's stupid, I said. The room became very silent. Current real-time polling in the All Thing showed 98% approval of CEO Gladstone's decision to fight rather than cede the colonial world of Hyperion to the ousters. Gladstone's political future rested on a positive outcome of the conflict. The men and women in that room had been instrumental in formulating the policy, making the decision to invade, and carrying out the logistics. The silence stretched.
Why is it stupid?
Gladstone asked softly. I made a gesture with my right hand. The hegemony's not been at war since its founding 7 centuries ago, I said. It's foolish to test its basic stability this way. Not at war? Shouted General Morpurgo. He gripped his knees with massive hands. What the hell do you call the Glenninite rebellion? A rebellion, I said. A mutiny. A police action. Senator Kolchev showed his teeth in a smile that held no amusement. He was from Lucis and seemed more muscle than man. Fleet actions, he said. 500,000 dead, 2 force divisions locked in combat for more than a year. Some police action, son. I said nothing. Leigh Hunt. Leigh Hunt? Leigh? Could be Lee. Leigh Hunt, an older, consumptive-looking man reported to be Gladstone's closest aide, cleared his throat. But what M7 says is interesting. Where do you see the difference between this, conflict and the Glenninite Wars, sir? Glenninite was a former Force officer, I said, aware that I was stating the obvious. The ousters have been an unknown quantity for centuries. The rebels' forces were known, their potential easily gauged. The ouster swarms have been outside the web since the Hegira. Glenninite stayed within the Protectorate, raiding worlds no farther than 2 months' time debt from the web. Hyperion is 3 years from Parvati, the closest web staging area. You don't think that we haven't thought of all this? Asked General Morpurgo. What about the Battle of Brescia? We've already fought the ousters there. That was no rebellion.
Quiet, please, said Leigh Hunt. Go on, M7.
I shrugged again. The primary difference is that in this case we are dealing with Hyperion, I said. Senator Richaud, one of the women present, nodded as if I had explained myself in full. You are afraid of the Shrike, she said. Do you belong to the Church of the Final Atonement? No, I said. I'm not a member of the Shrike cult.
What are you? Demanded Morpurgo.
An artist, I lied. Leigh Hunt smiled and turned to Gladstone.
I agree that we needed this perspective to sober us, CEO,
he said, gesturing toward the window and the hollow images showing the still applauding crowds.
But while our artist friend has brought up the necessary points, they have all been reviewed and weighed in full.
Senator Kolchev cleared his throat. I hate to mention the obvious when it seems we're all intent on ignoring it, but does this gentleman have the proper security clearance to be present at such a discussion? Gladstone nodded and showed the slight smile so many caricaturists had tried to capture. M7 has been commissioned by the Arts Ministry to do a series of drawings of me during the next few days or weeks. The theory is, I believe, that these will have some historical significance and may lead to a formal portrait. At any rate, M7 has been granted a T-level gold security clearance, and we may speak freely in front of him. Also, I appreciate his candor. Perhaps his arrival serves to suggest that our meeting has reached its conclusion. I will join you all in the war room at 0800 hours tomorrow morning, just before the fleet translates to Hyperion space. The group broke up at once. General Morpurgo glowered at me as he left. Senator Kolchev stared with some curiosity as he passed. Councillor Albedo merely faded into nothingness. Leigh Hunt was the only one besides Gladstone and me to remain behind. He made himself more comfortable by draping one leg over the arm of the priceless pre-Hedgery chair in which he sat.
Sit down,
said Hunt. I glanced at the CEO. She had taken her seat behind the massive desk, and now she nodded. I sat in the straight-backed chair General Morpurgo had occupied. CEO Gladstone said, "Do you really think that defending Hyperion is stupid?" Yes. Gladstone steepled her fingers and tapped at her lower lip. Behind her, the window showed the Armada party continuing in silent agitation. If you have any hope of being reunited with your counterpart, she said, it would seem to be in your interest for us to carry out the Hyperion campaign. I said nothing. The window view shifted to show the night sky still ablaze with fusion trails. Did you bring drawing materials? Asked Gladstone. I brought out the pencil and small sketch pad I had told Diana Philomel I did not have. Draw while we talk, said Maynard Gladstone. I began sketching, roughing in the relaxed, almost slumped posture, and then working on the details of the face. The eyes intrigued me. I was vaguely aware that Leigh Hunt was staring intently at me.
Joseph Seven, he said. An interesting choice of names.
I used quick, bold lines to give the sense of Gladstone's high brow and strong nose.
Do you know why people are leery of cybrids?
Hunt asked. Yes, I said. The Frankenstein monster syndrome. Fear of anything in human form that is not completely human. It's the real reason androids were outlawed, I suppose.
Uh-huh, agreed Hunt. But cybrids are completely human, aren't they?
Genetically they are, I said. I'm sorry, I'm going to change Hunt's voice. I apologize. So the next time he talks, it's going to be a different voice. Fair warning.
Unfair warning. Genetically they are, I said, but I found myself thinking of my mother, remembering the times I had read to her during her illness. I thought of my brother Tom. But they are also part of the core, I said, and thus fit the description of not completely human.
Are you part of the core? Asked Mina Gladstone, turning full face toward me.
I started a new sketch. Not really, I said. I can travel freely through the regions they allow me in, but it is more like someone accessing the datasphere than a true core personality's ability. Her face had been more interesting in three-quarters profile, but the eyes were more powerful when viewed straight on. I worked on the latticework of lines radiating from the corners of those eyes. Mina Gladstone obviously had never indulged in Poulsen treatments.
If it were possible to keep secrets from the core, said Gladstone, it would be folly to allow you free access to the councils of government. As it is...
She dropped her hands and sat up. I flipped to a new page.
As it is, said Gladstone, you have information I need. Is it true that you can read the mind of your counterpart, the first retrieval persona?
No, I said. It was difficult to capture the complicated interplay of line and muscle at the corners of her mouth. I sketched in my attempt to do so, moved on to the strong chin, and shaded the area beneath the underlip. Hunt frowned and glanced at the CEO. M. Gladstone brought her fingertips together again.
Explain, she said.
I looked up from the drawing. I dream, I said. The contents of the dream appear to correspond to the events occurring around the person carrying the implant of the previous Keats persona.
A woman.
Oh, sorry. A woman named Braun Lamia, said Leigh Hunt. Yes. Gladstone nodded.
So the original Keats persona, the one thought killed on Lucis, is still alive?
I paused. He is still aware, I said. You know that the primary personality substrate was extracted from the core, probably by the cybrid himself, and implanted in a Schroen loop bioshunt carried by M. Lamia.
Yes, yes, said Leigh Hunt, but the fact is, you are in contact with the Keats persona, and through him with the Shrike pilgrims.
Quick, dark strokes provided a dark background to give the sketch of Gladstone more depth. I am not actually in contact, I said. I dream dreams about Hyperion that your Fatline broadcasts have confirmed as conforming. Oh my gosh, that's tricky. I dream dreams about Hyperion that your Fatline broadcasts have confirmed as conforming to real-time events. I cannot communicate to the passive Keats persona, nor to its host or the other pilgrims. CEO Gladstone blinked.
How did you know about the Fatline broadcasts?
The consul told the other pilgrims about his Comlog's ability to relay through the Fatline transmitter in his ship. He told them just before they descended into the valley. Gladstone's tone hinted of her years as a lawyer before entering politics.
And how did the others respond to the consul's revelation?
I put the pencil back in my pocket. They knew there was a spy in their midst, I said. You told each of them. Gladstone glanced at her aide. Hunt's expression was blank.
If you're in touch with them, she said, you must know that we've received no message since before they left Keep Kronos to descend to the time tombs.
I shook my head. Last night's dream ended just as they approached the valley. Mina Gladstone rose, paced to the window, raised a hand, and the image went black.
So you don't know if any of them are still alive?
No.
What was their status the last time you dreamt?
Hunt was watching me as intensely as ever. Mina Gladstone was staring at the dark screen, her back to both of us. All of the pilgrims were alive, I said, with the possible exception of Het Mastine, the true voice of the tree.
He was dead?
He was dead? Asked Hunt.
He disappeared from the wind wagon on the sea of grass 2 nights before, only hours before the Ouster scouts had destroyed the tree ship Yggdrasil. But shortly before the pilgrims descended from Keep Kronos, they saw a robed figure crossing the sands towards the tombs.
Het Mastine?
Asked Gladstone. I lifted a hand. They assumed so. They were not sure.
Tell me about the others,
Said the CEO. I took a breath. I knew from the dreams that Gladstone had known at least 2 of the people on the last Shrike pilgrimage. Braun Lamia's father had been a fellow senator, and the hegemony consul had been Gladstone's personal representative in secret negotiations with the ousters. Father Hoyt is in great pain, I said. He told the story of the cruciform. The consul learned that Hoyt also wears one. 2, actually, Father Duray's and his own. Gladstone nodded.
so he still carries the resurrection parasite?
Yes.
Does it bother him more as he approaches the Shrike's lair?
I believe so, I said.
Go on.
The poet, Silenus, has been drunk much of the time. He is convinced that his unfinished poem predicted and determines the course of events.
On Hyperion?
Asked Gladstone, her back still turned. Everywhere, I said. Hunt glanced at the chief executive and then looked back at me.
Is Silenus insane?
I returned his gaze, but said nothing. In truth, I did not know.
Go on,
Gladstone said again. Colonel Cassard continues with his twin obsessions of finding the woman named Moneta and of killing the Shrike. He is aware that they may be one and the same.
Is he armed?
Gladstone's voice was very soft. Yes.
Go on.
Saul Weintraub, the scholar from Barnard's world, hopes to enter the tomb called the Sphinx as soon as...
Excuse me, said Gladstone, but is his daughter still with him?
Yes.
And how old is Rachel now?
5 days, I believe. I closed my eyes to remember the previous night's dream in greater detail. Yes, I said, 5 days.
And still aging backward in time?
Yes.
Go on, M7. Please tell me about Braun Lamia and the consul.
M. Lamia is carrying out the wishes of a former client and lover, I said. The Keats persona felt it was necessary for him to confront the Shrike. M. Lamia is doing it in his stead.
M7, began Leyhunt, you speak of the Keats persona as if it had no relevance or connection to your own. Later, please, Ley,
said Mina Gladstone. She turned to look at me.
I'm curious about the consul. Did he take his turn at telling his reason for joining the pilgrimage?
Yes, I said. Gladstone and Hunt waited. The consul told them about his grandmother, I said, the woman called Siri, who started the Maui Covenant Rebellion more than half a century ago. He told them about the death of his own family during the battle for Brescia, and he revealed his secret meetings with the ousters.
Is that all?
Asked Gladstone. Her brown eyes were very intense. No, I said. The consul told them that he had been the one to trigger an ouster device which hastened the opening of the time tombs. Hunt sat straight up, his leg dropping off the arm of the chair. Gladstone visibly took a breath.
Is that all?
Yes.
How did the others respond to his revelation of betrayal? She asked.
I paused, tried to reconstruct the dream images in a more linear fashion than memory provided. Some were outraged, I said, but none feels overwhelming loyalty to the hegemony at this point. They decided to go on. I believe that each of the pilgrims feels that punishment will be dealt out by the Shrike, not by human agency. Hunt slammed his fist down on the arm of the chair.
If the consul were here, he snapped, he'd fast discover otherwise. Quietly.
Gladstone paced back to her desk, touched some papers there. All of the comm lights were glowing impatiently. I found myself amazed that she could spend so much time talking to me at such an hour.
Thank you, M7, she said. I want you to be with us for the next few days. Someone will show you to your suite in the residential wing of Government House.
I rose. I'll return to Esperance for my things, I said.
No need, said Gladstone. They were brought here before you had stepped off the Terminex platform. Lee will show you out.
I nodded and followed the taller man toward the door.
Oh, M7,
Called Mina Gladstone. Yes? The CEO smiled.
I did appreciate your candor earlier, she said, but from this point on, let us assume that you are a court artist and a court artist alone. Sans opinions, sans visibility, sans mouth. Understood?
Understood, M. Executive, I said. Gladstone nodded, already turning her attention to the blinking phone lights.
Very good. Please bring your sketchbook to the meeting in the war room at 0800 hours.
A security guard met us in the anteroom and started to lead me toward the maze of corridors and checkpoints. Hunt called out for him to stop and strode across the wide hall, his steps echoing on the tile. He touched my arm.
Make no mistake, he said. We know, she knows, who you are and whom you represent.
I met his gaze and calmly extracted my arm. That's good, I said, because at this point I am quite sure that I do not know. So here's where I have to make a decision about how I'm going to do the rest of the book. Um, I think I know what I'm going to do. Yeah, heck with it. We'll take it as my gut says we were going to do it beforehand, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it does work, it does work. We'll find out the hard way. Chapter 3. 6 adults and an infant in a hostile landscape. Their fire seems a small thing against the darkness falling. Above them and beyond them, the hills of the valley rise like walls, while closer in, wrapped in the darkness of the valley itself, the huge shapes of the tombs seem to creep closer like saurian apparitions from some antediluvian age. Braun Lamia is tired and aching and very irritable. The sound of Saul Weintraub's baby crying sets her teeth on edge. She knows that the others are also tired. None has slept more than a few hours in the past 3 nights, and the day just ending has been filled with tension and unresolved terrors. She sets the last piece of wood on the fire.
There's no more where that came from,
Snaps Martin Silenus. The fire lights the poet's satyrish features from below. I know it, says Braun Lamia, too tired to put anger or any other energy into her voice. The firewood is from a cache carried in by pilgrim groups of years gone by. Their 3 small tents are set in the area traditionally used by the pilgrims in their last night before confronting the Shrike. They are camped close to the time tomb called the Sphinx, and the black sweep of what may be a wing blots out some of the sky. We'll use the lantern when this is gone, says the consul. The diplomat looks even more exhausted than the others. The flickering light casts a red tint over his sad features. He had dressed in diplomatic finery for the day, but now the cape and tricorn cap look as soiled and wilted as the consul himself. Colonel Cassad returns to the fire and slides the night visor up onto the top of his helmet. Cassad is wearing full combat gear, and the activated and the activated chameleon polymer shows only his face, floating 2 meters above the ground. Nothing, he says. No movement, no heat traces, no sound besides the wind. Kassad leans the Force multi-purpose assault rifle against a rock and sits near the others, the fibers of his impact armor deactivating into a matte black not much more visible than before.
Do you think the Shrike will come tonight?
Asks Father Hoyt. The priest has his black cloak wrapped around him and seems as much a part of the night as Colonel Kassad. The thin man's voice is strained. Kassad leans forward and pokes the fire with his baton. There is no way to tell. I'll stand watch just in case. Suddenly, all 6 look up as the star-filled sky spasms with color, orange and red blossoms unfolding silently, obliterating the star field.
There hasn't been much of that in the past few hours,
says Saul Weintraub, rocking his infant. Rachel has quit crying and now tries to grasp her father's short beard. Weintraub kisses her tiny hand. They're testing hegemony defenses again, says Kassad. Sparks rise from the prodded fire, embers floating into the sky as if seeking to join the brighter flames there. Who won? Asks Lamia, referring to the silent space battle which had filled the sky with violence all the night before and much of that day.
Who fucking cares?
Says Martin Silenus. He searches through the pockets of his fur coat as if he might find a full bottle there. He does not.
Who fucking cares?
He mutters again. I care, the consul says tiredly. If the ousters break through, they may destroy Hyperion before we find the Shrike. Silenus laughs derisively.
Oh, that'd be terrible, wouldn't it? To die before we discover death? To be killed before we are scheduled to be killed? To go out swiftly and without pain rather than to writhe forever on the Shrike's thorns? Oh, terrible thought, that.
Shut up, says Braun Lamia, and her voice again is without emotion, but this time is not devoid of threat. Shut up, says Braun Lamia. There we go. She looks at the consul. So where is the Shrike? Why didn't we find it? The diplomat stares at the fire. I don't know. Why should I? Why should I know? Perhaps the Shrike is gone, says Father Hoyt. Perhaps by collapsing the anti-entropic fields, you've freed it forever. Perhaps it's carried its scourge elsewhere. The consul shakes his head and says nothing. No, says Saul Weintraub. No, says Saul Weintraub. The baby is sleeping against his shoulder. It will be here. I feel it. Braun Lamia nods. So do I. It's waiting. She had retrieved several ration units from her pack, and now she pulls heating tabs and passes the units around.
I know that anticlimax is the warp and woof of the world, says Silenus, but this is fucking ridiculous. All dressed up with nowhere to die.
Braun Lamia glowers, but says nothing, and for a while they eat in silence. The flames fade from the sky, and the densely packed stars return, but embers continue to rise, as if seeking escape. Thanks for tuning in, Optical Antenna. I don't know what hand orange covering eyes means. It seems like code. I'll take your word for it. That's why it's convenient that these are on YouTube, isn't it? I suppose I could probably upload them to some like podcast type framework, but I'd have to find one. And I'd also have to stay current in downloading them and then re-uploading them, and then I'd probably have the excuse to do editing at that point. I don't really want the excuse. I'm lazy. Wrapped in the dream hazy tumble of Braun Lamia's thoughts, oh shoot.
Okay, so these transitions are going to be brutal. I am not going to get them right every time, and I am sorry.
Wrapped in the dream-hazy tumble of Braun Lamia's thoughts twice removed, I try to reassemble the events since last I dreamt their lives. The pilgrims had descended into the valley before dawn, singing, their shadows thrown before them by the light from a battle a billion kilometers above. All day they had explored the time tombs. Each minute they expected to die. After some hours the sun rose, and the high desert cold gave way to heat. Their fear and exultation faded. The long day was silent except for the rasp of sand, occasional shouts, and the constant, almost subliminal moan of the wind around rocks and tombs. Cassard and the consul each had brought an instrument that measured the intensity of the anti-entropic fields, but Lamia had been the first to notice that these were not needed, that the ebb and flow of the time tides could be felt as a slight nausea overladen with a sense of déjà vu which did not fade. Nearest to the entrance of the valley had been the Sphinx. Then came the jade tomb, its walls translucent only in the morning and evening twilight. Then, less than 100 meters farther in, rose the tomb called the Obelisk. The pilgrim path then led up the widening arroyo to the largest tomb of them all, centrally placed, the crystal monolith, its surface devoid of design or opening, its flat-topped roof flush with the tops of the valley walls. Then came the 3 cave tombs, their entrances visible only because of the well-worn paths that led to them. And finally, almost a kilometre further down the valley, sat the so-called Shrike Palace, its sharp flanges and outflung spires reminiscent of the spikes of the creature said to haunt this valley. All day they had moved from tomb to tomb, none venturing off alone, the group pausing before entering those artifacts which might be entered. Saul Weintraub had been all but overcome with emotion upon seeing and entering the Sphinx. The same tomb where his daughter had contracted the Merlin sickness 26 years earlier. The instruments set out by her university team still sat on tripods outside the tomb, although none in the group could tell if they still functioned, carrying out their monitoring duties. The passageways in the Sphinx were as narrow and labyrinthine as Rachel's comlog entries had suggested, the strings of glow globes and electric lights left behind by various research groups now dark and depleted. They used hand torches and Cassard's night visor to explore the place. There was no sign of the room Rachel had been in when the walls closed in on her and the sickness began. There were only vestigial remnants of the once powerful time tides. There was no sign of the Shrike. Each tomb had offered its moment of terror, of hopeful and dreadful anticipation, only to be replaced by an hour or more of anticlimax as dusty, empty rooms appeared just as they had to the tourists and Shrike pilgrims of centuries past. Eventually, the day had ended in disappointment and fatigue, the shadows from the eastern valley wall drawing across the tombs and valley like a curtain, closing an unsuccessful play. The day's heat had vanished, and the high desert cold returned quickly, borne on a wind that smelled of snow and the high reaches of the Bridle Range, 20 kilometres to the southwest. Cassard suggested that they make camp. The consul had shown the way to the traditional grounds where the Shrike pilgrims had waited their last night before meeting the creature they sought. The flat area near the Sphinx, showing traces of litter from research groups as well as pilgrims, pleased Saul Weintraub, who imagined his daughter had camped there. No one else objected. Now, in full darkness, with the last piece of wood burning, I sensed the 6 of them drawing closer, not merely to the fire's warmth, but to each other, drawn by the fragile but tangible cords of shared experience forged during their voyage upriver on the levitation barge Benares and in their crossing to Keep Kronos. More than that, I sensed a unity more palpable than emotional bonds. It took a moment, but I soon realized that the group was connected in a microsphere of shared data and sense web. On a world whose primitive regional data relays had been shredded by the first hint of combat, this group had linked comlogs and biomonitors to share information and to watch over one another as best they could. While the entry barriers were obvious and solid, I had no trouble sliding past, through and under them, picking up the finite but numerous clues. Pulse, skin temperature, cortical wave activity, access request, data inventory, which allowed me some insight into what each pilgrim was thinking, feeling, and doing. Cassard, Hoyt, and Lamia had implants. The flow of their thoughts were easiest to sense. At that second, Braun Lamia was wondering if it had not been a mistake to seek out the Shrike. Something was nagging at her, just under the surface, but unrelenting in its demand to be heard. She felt as if she were ignoring some terribly important clue which held the solution to what? Braun Lamia had always despised mysteries. It was one of the reasons she had left a life of some comfort and leisure to become a private investigator. But what mystery? She had all but solved the murder of her cybrid client and lover, and had come to Hyperion to fulfill his final wish. Yet she sensed that this nagging doubt had little to do with the Shrike. What? Lamia shook her head and poked the dying fire. Her body was strong, raised to resist Lucis's 1.3 standard gravity, trained to even greater strength. But she had not slept in several days, and she was very, very tired. She became vaguely aware that someone was speaking.
Just to take a shower and get some food, says Martin Silenus. Perhaps use your comm unit and Fatline link to see who's winning the war.
The consul shakes his head. Not yet. The ship is for an emergency. Silenus gestures toward the night, the Sphinx, and the rising wind.
You think that this isn't an emergency?
Braun Lamia realizes that they are talking about the consul bringing his spacecraft here from the city of Keats. Are you sure that the absence of alcohol isn't the emergency you're referring to? She asks. Silenus glares at her.
Would it hurt to have a drink?
No, says the consul. He rubs his eyes, and Lamia remembers that he too is addicted to alcohol. But his answer to bringing the ship here had been no. We'll wait until we have to. What about the Fatline transmitter? Says Cassad. The consul nods and removes the antique comlog from his small pack. The instrument had belonged to his grandmother Siri and to her grandparents before her. The consul touches the disk key. I can broadcast with this, but not receive. Saul Weintraub has set his sleeping child in the opening of the closest tent. Now he turns toward the fire. And the last time you transmitted a message was when we arrived in the keep? Yes. Martin Silenus's tone is sarcastic.
And we're supposed to believe that from a confessed traitor?
Yes. Yes. The consul's voice is a distillation of pure weariness. Cassad's thin face floats in the darkness. His body, legs, and arms are discernible only as a blackness against the already dark background. But it will serve to call the ship if we need it? Yes. Father Hoyt hugs his cloak tighter around him to keep it from flapping in the rising wind. Sand scrapes against wool and tent fabric. Aren't you afraid that the port authorities or force will move the ship or tamper with it? He asks the consul. No. The consul's head moves only slightly, as if he is too tired to shake it completely. Our clearance pip was from Gladstone herself. Also, the Governor General is a friend of mine. Was a friend. The others had met the recently promoted hegemony governor shortly after landing. To Braun Lamia, Theo Lane had seemed a man catapulted into events too large for his talents. The wind's coming up, says Saul Weintraub. He turns his body to protect the baby from flying sand. Still squinting into the gale, the scholar says, I wonder if Hetman Steen is out there. We searched everywhere, says Father Hoyt. We searched everywhere, says Father Hoyt. His voice is muffled because he has lowered his head into the folds of his cloak. Martin Silenus laughs.
Pardon me, priest, he says, but you're full of shit.
The poet stands and walks to the edge of the firelight. The wind ruffles the fur of his coat and rips his words away into the night.
The cliff walls hold 1,000 hiding places. The crystal monolith hides its entrance to us. But to a Templar? And besides, you saw the stairway to the labyrinth in the deepest room of the Jade Tomb.
Hoyt looks up, squinting against the pinpricks of blowing sand. You think he's there, in the labyrinth? Silenus laughs and raises his arms. The silk of his loose blouse ripples and billows.
How the fuck should I know, Padre? All I know is that Hetmastine could be out there now, watching us, waiting to come back to claim his luggage.
The poet gestures toward the Mobius cube in the center of their small pile of gear.
Or he could be dead already. Or worse.
Worse? Says Hoyt. The priest's face has aged in the past few hours. His eyes are sunken mirrors of pain, his smile a rictus. Martin Silenus strides back to the dying fire.
Worse, he says. He could be twisting on the Shrike's steel tree, where we'll be in a few.
Braun Lamia rises suddenly and grasps the poet by his shirt front. She lifts him off the ground, shakes him, lowers him until his face is on a level with hers. Once more, she says softly, and I'll do very painful things to you. I won't kill you, but you'll wish I had. The poet shows his satyr's smile. Lamia drops him and turns her back. Cassad says, We're tired. Everyone turn in. I'll stand watch. My dreams of Lamia are mixed with Lamia's dreams. It is not unpleasant to share a woman's dreams, a woman's thoughts, even those of a woman separated from me by a gulf of time and culture far greater than any imagined gap of gender. In a strange and oddly mirror-like way, she dreamed of her dead lover, Johnny, of his too small nose and his too stubborn jaw, his too long hair curling over his collar, and his eyes, those too expressive, too revealing eyes, that too freely animated a face which might, except for those eyes, belong to any one of 1,000 peasants born within a day's ride of London. The face she dreamed was mine. The voice she heard in that dream was mine. But the love-making she dreamed of, remembering now, was nothing that I had shared. I sought to escape her dream, if only to find my own. If I were to be a voyeur, it might as well be in the tumble of manufactured memories which passed for my own dreams. But I was not allowed to dream my own dreams. Not yet. I suspect that I was born, and born again from my deathbed, simply to dream those dreams of my dead and distant twin. I resigned myself, ceased my struggles to awaken, and dreamed. Braun Lamia comes awake swiftly, jarringly, shaken from a pleasant dream by some sound or movement. For a long second she is disoriented. It is dark. There is a noise, not mechanical, which is louder than most sounds in the Lucis hive where she lives. She is drunk with fatigue, but knows that she is awakened after very little sleep. She is alone in a small confined space, in something resembling an oversized body bag. Raised on a world where enclosed places mean security from vicious air, winds, and animals, where many people suffer from agoraphobia when confronting the rare open space, but few know the meaning of claustrophobia, Braun Lamia nonetheless reacts as a claustrophobe, clawing for air, pushing aside bedroll and tent flaps in a panicked rush to escape the small cocoon of fiber plastic, crawling, pulling herself along by her hands and forearms and elbows until there is sand under her palms and sky above. Not really sky, she realizes, suddenly seeing and remembering where she is. Sand. A blowing, raging, whirling sandstorm of particles, stinging her face like pinpricks. The campfire is out and covered with sand. The campfire is out and covered with sand. Sand has banked on the windward side of all three of the tents, their sides flapping, cracking like rifle shots in the wind, and dunes of new blown sand have grown up around the camp, leaving streaks and furrows and ridges in the lee of tents and gear. No one stirs from the other tents. The tent she was sharing with Father Hoyt is half collapsed, all but buried by the rising dunes. Hoyt. It had been his absence which had awakened her. Even in her dreams, some part of her consciousness had been aware of the soft breathing and almost indistinguishable moans from the sleeping priest as he wrestled with his pain. Some time in the past half hour he had left. Probably not more than a few minutes before. Braun Lamia knew that, even as she had dreamed of Johnny, she had been half aware of a rustling, sliding sound above the rasp of sand and roar of the wind. Lamia gets to her feet and shields her eyes from the sandstorm. It is very dark. The stars are occluded by high cloud and the surface storm, but a faint, almost electrical radiance fills the air and reflects from rock and dune surface. Lamia realizes that it is electrical, that the air is filled with a static which makes the curls of her hair leap and writhe in Medusa-like gyrations. Static charges creep along her tunic sleeves and float over the tent surfaces like St. Elmo's fire. As her eyes adapt, Lamia realizes that the shifting dunes are aglow with pale fire. 40 meters to the east, the tomb called the Sphinx is a crackling, pulsing outline in the night. Waves of current move along the outflung appendages, often called the wings. Braun Lamia looks around, sees no sign of Father Hoyt, and considers calling for help. She realizes that her voice will not be heard above the wind roar. She wonders for a second whether the priest has merely gone to one of the other tents or to the crude latrine 20 meters west, but something tells her that this is not the case. She looks at the Sphinx and, for the briefest second, seems to see the shape of a man, black cloak flapping like a falling pendant, shoulders hunched against the wind, outlined against the static glow of the tomb. A hand falls on her shoulder. Braun Lamia twists away, falls into a fighting crouch, left fist extended, right hand rigid. She recognizes Cassad standing there. The colonel is half again as tall as Lamia, and half as broad, and miniature lightning plays across his thin form as he leans closer to shout in her ear, "He went that way!" The long black scarecrow arm extends toward the Sphinx. Lamia nods and shouts back, her voice almost inaudible to herself above the roar, "Shall we wake the others?" She had forgotten that Cassad was standing watch. Did the man never sleep? Fedman Cassad shakes his head. His visors are up and the helmet destructured to form a hood on the back of his combat-armored coverall. Oh, I misread that. Or I read that in the most bewilderingly confusing way possible. His visors are up and the helmet destructured to form a hood on the back of his combat-armored coverall. There's a lot of hyphens in there. Cassad's face looks very pale in the glow from his suit. He gestures toward the Sphinx. His multi-purpose force rifle is nestled in the crook of his left arm. Grenades, binocular case, and more mysterious items are draped from hooks and web belts on his impact armor. He points again toward the Sphinx. Lamia leans forward and shouts, "Did the Shrike take him?" Kassad shakes his head. "Can you see him?" She gestures toward his night visor and binoculars. "No," says Kassad. "The storm fouls up heat signatures." Broad Lamia turns her back to the wind, feeling the particles striking her neck like needles from a flechette gun. She queries her comlog, but it tells her only that Hoyt is alive and moving. Nothing else is being transmitted on the common band. She moves until she is next to Kassad, their backs forming a wall against the gale. "Are we going to follow him?" she shouts. Kassad shakes his head. "We can't leave the perimeter unguarded. I left telltales, but—" He gestures toward the storm. Braun Lamia ducks back in the tent, tugs on her boots, and emerges with her all-weather cape and her father's automatic pistol. A more conventional weapon, a Geyer stunner, is in the breast pocket of the cape. Gier. I'm going to say Geyer. "I'll go then," she says. At first she thinks that the colonel has not heard her, but then she sees something in his pale eyes, and knows that he has. He taps the military comlog on his wrist. Lamia nods and makes sure that her own implant and comlog are set to the widest bandwidth. "I'll be back," she says, and wades up the growing dune. Her pant legs glow with static discharge, and the sand seems alive with silver-white pulses of current fleeting across its variegated surfaces. Surface, singular. Sorry. 20 meters from the camp, and she can see nothing of it. 10 meters farther, and the Sphinx rises above her. There is no sign of Father Hoyt. Footsteps do not survive 10 seconds in the storm. The wide entrance to the Sphinx is open, has been open as long as mankind has known of this place. Now it is a black rectangle in a faintly glowing wall. Logic suggested that Hoyt would have gone there, if only to get out of the storm, but something quite beyond logic tells her that this is not the priest's destination. Braun Lamia trudges past the Sphinx, rests in its lee for several moments to wipe the sand from her face and to breathe freely again, and then she moves on, following a faint, hard-packed trail between the dunes. Ahead of her, the jade tomb glows a milky green in the night, its smooth curves and crests oily with an ominous glow. Squinting, Lamia looks again and sees someone or something outlined against that glow for the most fleeting of instants. Then the figure is gone, either inside the tomb or invisible against the black semicircle of its entrance. Lamia puts her head down and moves forward, the wind pushing and shoving at her as if hurrying her towards something important. So you see that some of these chapters are going to be kind of tricky for me, so I apologize about any halting uh, delivery on some of these. First of all, Dan Simmons writes at a fairly high literary level, um, which is real easy to intuit in your head if you've read lots of books, but is not necessarily easy to read aloud, even if you're mildly practiced like myself, as I toot my own horn. Uh, Also, we have perspective shifts, a lot of them. So I'm going to sometimes stumble on that where it's like, well, wait a minute, now we have to use present tense on everything because my brain is going to automatically do whatever it's been doing, and sometimes that's wrong. So here we go. So though you can see, however, that there is a pattern here, sort of, that's going to be played with a little bit. And there's going to be longer portions of given perspectives and whatnot.
It's rather different than the previous book we went through, but still has sort of a rhyme to it, if you will. Chapter 4. The military briefing droned on toward mid-morning. I suspect that such meetings had shared the same qualities, brisk monotone continuing like a background buzz, the stale taste of too much coffee, the pall of smoke in the air, stacks of hard copy, and the cortical overlay vertigo of implant access, for many centuries. I suspect it was simpler when I was a boy. Wellington rounded up his men, those he dispassionately and accurately called the scum of the earth, told them nothing, and sent them off to die. I brought my attention back to the group. We were in a large room, grey walls relieved by white rectangles of light, grey carpet, gunmetal grey horseshoe table with black disc keys and the occasional carafe of water. I believe that's pronounced carafe, C-A-R-A-F-E. I don't think it's carafe because there's no accent on the E. I'm going to go with carafe. I can't remember the last time I've heard that pronounced out loud, so my memory may be failing me. CEO Mina Gladstone sat at the center of the arc of the table, ranking senators and cabinet ministers near her, military officers and other second-rank decision-makers farther along the curve. Behind them all, not at the table, sat the inevitable clusters of aides, none of the force people below the rank of colonel. What? None of the force people below the rank of colonel, and behind them aides to the aides. Okay, behind them all, not at the table, sat the inevitable clusters of aides, none of the force people below the rank of colonel, and behind them, on less comfortable-looking chairs, the aides to the aides. I had no chair. With a cluster of other invited but obviously purposeless personnel, I sat on a stool near a rear corner of the room, 20 meters. Oh boy, 20 meters from the CEO and even farther from the briefing officer, a young colonel with a pointer in his hand and no hesitation whatsoever in his voice. Behind the colonel was the gold and grey slab of a call-up template. Before him the slightly raised omnisphere of the kind found in any hollow pit. From time to time the call-up clouded and leaped to life, at other times the air misted with complex hollows. Miniatures of these diagrams glowed on every disk-key plate and hovered above some comlogs. I sat on my stool, watched Gladstone, and drew an occasional sketch. Awakening that morning in the Government House guest room, bright Tau Ceti sunlight streaming between peach-coloured drapes, which had opened automatically at my 0630 wake-up time, there was a second when I was lost, displaced, still in pursuit of Lenar Hoyt and in fear of the Shrike and Hetmastine. Then, as if some power had granted my wish to leave me to dream my own dreams, there was a minute where confusion compounded, and I sat up gasping, looking around in alarm, expecting the lemon carpet and peach-coloured light to fade like the fever dream it was, leaving only the pain and phlegm and terrible hemorrhages, blood on linen, the light-filled room dissolving into the shadows of the dark apartment on the Piazza di Spagna. Spagna? I think that's Spagna. On the Piazza di Spagna, and looming over all, the sensitive face of Joseph Seven leaning forward, watching and waiting for me to die. I showered twice, first with water and then with Sonic, dressed in a new grey suit that lay set out for me on the just-made bed when I emerged from the bathroom, and set off to find the east courtyard where, a courtesy pip left near my new clothing had told me, breakfast was being served for Government House guests. The orange juice was fresh squeezed. The bacon was crisp and authentic. The newspaper said that CEO Gladstone would be addressing the web via All Thing and Media at 10:30 hours Web Standard. The pages were full of war news. Flat photos of the Armada glowed in full colour.
General Morpurgo glared out grimly from page 3. The paper called him the hero of the Second Height Rebellion. Diana Philomel glanced over toward me from a nearby table where she dined with her Neanderthal husband. Her gown was more formal this morning, dark blue and far less revealing, but a slit up the side allowed a hint of last night's show. She kept her eyes on me as she lifted a strip of bacon with lacquered nails and took a careful bite. Hermund Philomel grunted as he read something agreeable on the folded financial pages.
The Ouster Migration Cluster, commonly known as a swarm, was detected by Hawking distortion sensing equipment in the CAM system a little more than 3 standard years ago,
The young briefing officer was saying.
Immediately upon detection, Force Task Force 42, preconfigured for evacuation of Hyperion system, spun up to C+ status from Parvati with sealed orders to create Farcaster capability within portal range of Hyperion. At the same time, Task Force 87.2 was dispatched from Solkov Takata staging area around Cam 3 with orders to rendezvous with the evacuation force in Hyperion system to find the Ouster Migration Cluster and to engage and destroy their military components.
Images of the Armada appeared on the call-up temp and in front of the young colonel. He gestured with his pointer, and a line of ruby light cut through the larger hollow to illuminate one of the 3C ships in the formation.
Task Force 87.2 is under the command of Admiral Nishida aboard the HS Hebrides.
Yes, yes, grumbled General Morpurgo. We know all this, Yanni. Cut to the quick.
The young colonel simulated a smile, nodded imperceptibly toward the general and CEO Gladstone, and resumed in a voice a trifle less confident.
Coded fat line transmissions from TF-42 during the past 72 hours, standard, reported pitched battles between scouting elements of the evacuation task force and forward elements of the Ouster Migration Cluster.
The swarm,
interrupted Leigh Hunt.
Yes,
said Yanni. He turned toward the call-up, and 5 meters of frosted glass burned to life. To me, the display was an incomprehensible maze of arcane symbols, colored vector lines, substrate codes, and force acronyms which added up to total gibberish. Perhaps it made no sense to the big brass and senior politicians in the room either, but no one let on that this was the case. I began a new drawing of Gladstone, with the with the bulldog profile of Morpurgo in the background.
Although first reports suggested Hawking wakes in the neighborhood of 4,000 drives, this is a misleading figure,
continued the colonel named Yanni. I wondered whether that was his first or last name.
As you know, Ouster swarms can be constituted of up to 10,000 separate drive units, but the vast majority of these are small and either unarmed or of negligible military significance. Microwave, fat line, and other emission signature evaluation suggests. Excuse me,
said Mina Gladstone, her weathered voice in sharp contrast to the briefing officer's syrupy flow.
But could you tell us how many of the Ouster ships are of military significance?
Said the colonel, and glanced toward his superiors. General Morpurgo cleared his throat.
We think about 600-700 tops, he said. Nothing to worry about.
CEO Gladstone raised an eyebrow.
And the size of our battle groups?
Morpurgo nodded toward the young colonel to stand at ease. Morpurgo answered.
Task Force 72 has about 60 ships, CEO. Task Force
42 is the evacuation group, said Gladstone.
General Morpurgo nodded, and I thought I saw a hint of condescension in his smile.
Yes, ma'am. Task Force 87.2, the battle group, which translated in system about an hour ago, will...
Were 60 ships adequate to face 600 or 700? Asked Gladstone.
Morpurgo glanced toward one of his fellow officers as if asking for patience. Yes, he said, more than adequate. You have to understand, CEO, that 600 Hawking drives may sound like a lot, but they're nothing to worry about when they're pushing single ships or scouts or one of those little 5-person attack craft they call Lancers. Task Force 42 consisted of almost 24 mainline spin ships, including the carriers Olympus Shadow and Neptune Station. Each of these can launch more than 100 fighters or ALRs. Morpurgo fumbled in his pocket, pulled out a recon smokestick the size of a cigar, appeared to remember that Gladstone disapproved of them, and stuck it back in his coat. He frowned. When Task Force 87.2 completes its deployment, we'll have more than enough firepower to deal with a dozen swarms. Still frowning, he nodded toward Yanni to continue. The colonel cleared his throat and gestured with his pointer toward the call-up display.
As you can see, Task Force 42 has had no trouble clearing the necessary volume of space to initiate Farcaster construction. This construction was begun 6 weeks ago, WST, and completed yesterday at 16:24 hours standard. Initial ouster harassing tactics were beaten off with no casualties for TF-42, and during the past 48 hours, a major battle has been waged between advance units of the task force and main ouster forces. The focus of this skirmish has been here.
Yanni gestured again, and a section of the call-up panel pulsed with blue light beyond the tip of his pointer.
29 degrees above the plane of the ecliptic, 30 AU from Hyperion's sun, approximately 0.35 AU from the hypothetical rim of the system's Oort cloud.
Casualties? Said Leyhunt.
Quite within acceptable limits for a firefight of this duration, said the young colonel,
who looked like he had never been within a light year of hostile fire. His blond hair was carefully combed to the side, and gleamed under the intense glow of the spots.
26 hegemony fast attack fighters destroyed or missing, 12 torpedo-carrying ALRs, 3 torch ships, the fuel transport Asquith's Pride, and the cruiser Draconi 3.
Draconi the Third? It's 3 Roman numerals. Maybe it's Draconi the Third. Whatever. But it could be named after the planet, so it could be Draconi. Whatever.
How many people lost?
Asked CEO Gladstone. Her voice was very quiet. Yanni glanced quickly at Morpurgo. Oh, sorry. Asked CEO Gladstone. Her voice was very quiet. Yanni glanced quickly at Morpurgo, but answered the question himself.
Around 2,300, he said. But rescue operations are currently being carried out, and there is some hope of finding survivors of the Draconi.
He smoothed his tunic and went on quickly.
This should be weighed against the confirmed kills of at least 150 ouster warships. Our own raids into the migration cluster, the Swarm, have resulted in an additional 30 to 60 destroyed craft, including comet farms, ore processing ships, and at least 1 command cluster.
Mina Gladstone rubbed her gnarled fingers together.
Did the casualty estimate, our casualties, include the passengers and crew of the destroyed tree ship Yggdrasil, which we had chartered for the evacuation? No, ma'am, Yanni responded briskly. Although there was an ouster raid in progress at the time, our analysis shows that the Yggdrasil was not destroyed by enemy action.
Gladstone raised an eyebrow.
What then? Sabotage, as far as we can tell at this time, said the colonel.
He prompted another Hyperion system diagram into the call-up. General Morpurgo glanced at his comlog and said, Skip to the ground defenses, Yanni. The CEO has to deliver her speech in 30 minutes. I completed the sketch of Gladstone and Morpurgo, stretched, and looked around for another subject. Leigh Hunt seemed a challenge, with his nondescript, almost pinched features. When I glanced back up, a hollowed globe, spelled rather differently, you know. H-O-L-O, there's only one O. Hollowed. When I glanced back up, a hollowed globe of Hyperion ceased spinning. It unwound itself into a series of flattened projections, oblique equirect. Oh my god, here we go. Fun times reading these words on a good day, let alone in an accent I'm not exactly good at. Oblique equirectangular, Bonn, orthographic rosette, Van der Grinten, gauze, interrupted good homolocine, mnemonic, sinusoidal, azimuthal equidistant, polyconic, hypercorrected Kuatzi, computer eshed, Briesmeister, Buckminster, millicylindrical, multi-colligraphed, and sat-plot standard, before resolving into a standard Robinson-Baird map of Hyperion. Don't make me repeat that, but I'm going to do it anyway just to giggle. Because sometimes we repeat passages that wow us, as we did multiple times throughout our run of C.J. Sherry. Oh God, how am I going to get through this again? It's hard. Like, there's no way to auto read through this either. It's like you have to be on it. When I glanced back up, a hollowed globe of Hyperion ceased spinning and unwound itself into a series of flattened projections. Oblique equirectangular, Bonn, orthographic, rosette, Van der Grinten, gauze, interrupted good homolocine, mnemonic, sinusoidal, azimuthal equidistant, polyconic, hypercorrected Kuatzi, computer eshed, Briesmeister, Buckminster, millicylindrical, multicolligraphed, and sat-plot standard, before resolving into a standard Robinson-Baird map of Hyperion. I smiled. That had been the most enjoyable thing I'd seen since the briefing began. Several of Gladstone's people were shifting with impatience. They wanted at least 10 minutes with the CEO before the broadcast began.
As you know, began the colonel, Hyperion is old Earth standard to 9.89 on the Thuron-Laumier scale of...
Oh, for Christ's sakes, growled Morpurgo. Get to the troop dispositions and get it over with.
Yes, sir.
Yanni swallowed and lifted his pointer. His voice was no longer confident.
As you know,
He pointed to the northernmost continent, floating like a poorly done sketch of a horse's head and neck, terminating jaggedly where the beast's chest and back muscles would begin.
This is Equus. It has a different official name, but everyone calls it that since... This is Equus. The chain of islands running southeast, here and here, is called the Cat and Nine Tails. Actually, it's an archipelago with more than 100... Anyway, the second major continent is called Aquila, and perhaps you can see it's shaped something like an old Earth eagle with the beak here on the northwest coast, and the talons extended here to the southwest, and at least one wing raised here, running to the northeast coast. This section is the so-called Pinion Plateau and is almost inaccessible due to the flame forests. But here and here to the southwest are the main fiberplastic plantations.
The disposition of troops, growled Morpurgo.
I sketched Yanni. I discovered that it is impossible to convey the sheen of sweat with graphite.
Sassy! Yes, sir. The third continent is Ursus. It looks a bit like a bear, but no force troops landed there because it's south polar, almost uninhabitable, although the Hyperion Self-Defense Force keeps a listening post there.
Yanni seemed to sense that he was babbling. He drew himself up, wiped his upper lip with the back of his hand, and continued in a more composed tone.
Primary force, ground installations here, here, and here.
His pointer illuminated areas near the capital of Keats, high on the neck of Equus.
Force space units have secured the primary spaceport at the capital, as well as secondary fields here and here.
He touched the cities of Endymion and Port Romance, both on the continent of Aquila. Force ground units have prepared defensive installations here. 24 red lights winked on, most on the neck and main areas of Equus, but several in Aquila's Beak and Port Romance regions. These include elements of the Marines, as well as ground defenses, ground-to-air, and ground-to-space components. High Command expects that, unlike Brescia, there will be no battles on the planet itself, but should they attempt an invasion, we will be ready for them. Mina Gladstone checked her comlog. 17 minutes remained until her live broadcast.
What about evacuation plans?
Yanni's regained composure crumbled. He looked in some desperation toward his superior officers.
No evacuation, said Admiral Singh. It was a feint, a lure for the ousters.
Gladstone tapped her fingers together.
There are several million people on Hyperion, Admiral.
Yes, said Singh, and we'll protect them, but an evacuation of even the 60,000 or so hegemony citizens is quite out of the question. It would be chaos if we allowed all 3 million into the web. Besides, for security reasons, it is not possible.
The Shrike? Queried Leigh Hunt. Lee Hunt? I still haven't decided how that's pronounced.
Security reasons,
repeated General Morpurgo. He stood up, took the pointer from Yanni. The young man stood there for a second, irresolute, seeing no place to sit or stand, and then he moved to the rear of the room near me, stood at parade rest, and stared at something near the ceiling, possibly the end of his military career.
Task Force 87.2 is in system, said Morpurgo. The ousters have pulled back to their swarm center, about 60 AU from Hyperion. To all intents and purposes, the system is secure. Hyperion is secure. We're waiting for a counterattack, but we know that we can contain it. Again, to all intents and purposes, Hyperion is now part of the web. Questions?
There were none. Gladstone left with Leigh Hunt, a pack of senators, and her aides. It must be Leigh. Of course I'm going to doubt myself every time I say it. Gladstone left with Leigh Hunt, a pack of senators, and her aides. The military brass gravitated to huddles, apparently as dictated by rank. Aides scattered. A few reporters allowed in the room ran to their imager crews waiting outside. The young colonel, Yanni, remained at parade rest, his eyes unfocused, his face very pale. I sat for a moment, staring at the call-up map of Hyperion. The continent Equus's resemblance to a horse was greater at this distance. From where I sat I could just make out the mountains of the bridle range, and the orange-yellow colouring of the high desert below the horse's eye. There were no forced defensive positions marked northeast of the mountains, no symbols at all, besides a tiny red glow which might have been the dead city of poets. The time tombs were not marked at all. It was as if the tombs had no military significance, no part to play in the day's proceedings. But somehow I knew better. Somehow I suspected that the entire war, the movement of thousands, the fate of millions, perhaps billions, depended upon the actions of 6 people in that unmarked stretch of orange and yellow. I folded my sketchbook, stuffed my pencils in pockets, looked for an exit, found it, and used it. Leigh Hunt. I'm going to say it differently every time, get used to it. Leigh Hunt met me in one of the long hallways that led to the main entrance.
You are leaving?
I took a breath. Aren't I allowed to? Hunt smiled, as if one could call that upward folding of thin lips a smile.
Of course, M7, but CEO Gladstone has asked me to tell you that she would like to speak to you again this afternoon.
When? Hunt shrugged.
Any time after her speech, at your convenience.
I nodded. Literally millions of lobbyists, job seekers, would-be biographers, business people, fans of the CEO, and potential assassins would give almost anything to have a minute with the hegemony's most visible leader, a few seconds with CEO Gladstone, and I could see her at my convenience. No one ever said that the universe was sane. I brushed past Leigh Hunt and made for the front door. By long tradition, Government House had no public Farcaster portals within its walls. It was a short walk past the main entrance security baffles, across the garden, to the low, white building that served as press headquarters and Terminex. The news teeps were clustered around a central viewing pit, where the familiar face and voice of Llewellyn Drake, the voice of the All-Thing, gave background to CEO Gladstone's speech of vital importance to the hegemony. I nodded in his direction, found an unused portal, presented my universal card, and went in search of a bar. The Grand Concourse was, once you got there, the one place in the web where you could Farcast for free. Every world in the web had offered at least one of its finest urban blocks. TC Squared provided 23 blocks for shopping, entertainment, fine restaurants, and bars. Especially bars. Like River Tethys, the Grand Concourse flowed between military-sized Farcaster portals 200 meters high. With wraparound, the effect was of an infinite main street, 100-kilometer torus of material delights. One could stand, as I did that morning, under the brilliant sun of Tau Ceti, and look down the concourse to the nighttime midway of Deneb Dry, alive with neon and hollows, and catch a glimpse of the hundred-tiered main mall of Lucis, while knowing that beyond it lay the shadow-dappled boutiques of God's Grove, with its brick concourse and elevators to treetops, the most expensive eatery in the web. I didn't give a damn about all that. I just wanted to find a quiet bar. TC Squared bars were too filled with bureaucrats, teeps, and business types, so I caught one of the concourse shuttles and stepped off on Sol Draconi Septim's main drag. The gravity discouraged many, it discouraged me, but it meant that the bars were less full, and those there had come to drink. The place I chose was a ground-level bar, almost hidden under the support pillars and service chutes to the main shopping trellis, and it was dark inside. Dark walls, dark wood, dark patrons, their skin as black as mine was pale. It was a good place to drink, and I did so, starting with a double scotch and getting more serious as I went along. Even there I couldn't be free of Gladstone. Far across the room, a flat-screen TV showed the CEO's face with the blue and gold backs. Blah. I'm having a hard time. Far across the room, a flat-screen TV, which, by the way, casual reminder, this was written in like 80-something. Does this say the publishing date of Fall of Hyperion? 1990. Call it 1980 because he would have had to have been working on it back a while back before then, along with Hyperion. We didn't have flat screen TVs back then, is the joke that I'm making here. Not in the sense that we know them anyway. Where was I? Even there I couldn't be free of Gladstone. Far across the room, a flat-screen TV showed the CEO's face with the blue and gold background she used for state broadcasts. Several of the other drinkers had gathered to watch. I heard snatches of the speech.
To ensure the safety of hegemony citizens, and cannot be allowed to endanger the safety of the web or our allies in. Thus, I have authorized a full military response to.
Turn that goddamn thing down! I was amazed to realize that it was me shouting. The patrons glowered over their shoulders, but they turned it down. I watched Gladstone's mouth move a moment, and then I waved to the bartender for another double. Some time later, it might have been hours, I looked up from my drink to realize that there was someone sitting across from me in the dark booth. It took me a second, blinking, to recognize who it was in the dim light. For a second my heart raced as I thought, Fanny. But then I blinked again and said, Lady Philomel. She still wore the dark blue dress I'd seen her in at breakfast. Somehow it seemed cut lower now. Her face and shoulders seemed to glow in the near darkness.
M7, she said. M7, she said, her voice almost a whisper. I've come to redeem your promise.
Promise? I waved the bartender over, but he did not respond. I frowned and looked at Diana Philomel. What promise?
To draw me, of course. Did you forget your promise at the party?
I snapped my fingers, but the insolent barkeep did not deign to look my way. I did draw you, I said.
Yes, said Lady Philomel, but not all of me.
I sighed and drained the last of my scotch. Drinking, I said. Lady Philomel smiled.
So I see.
I started to stand to go after the bartender, thought better of it, and sat back slowly onto the weathered wood of the bench. Armageddon, I said. They're playing with Armageddon. I looked at the woman carefully, squinting slightly to bring her into focus. Do you know that word, m'lady?
I don't believe he will serve you more alcohol, she said. I have drinks at my place. You could have one while you draw.
I squinted again, craftily now. I might have had a few too many scotches, but they hadn't impaired my awareness. Husband, I said. Diana Philomel smiled again, and that too was radiant.
Spending several days at Government House, she said. True, spending several days at Government House,
she said, truly whispering now.
He can't be far from the source of power at such an important time. Come, my vehicle is just outside. It's just outside.
I don't remember paying, but I assume I did. Or Lady Philomel did. I don't remember her helping me outside, but I assume that someone did. Perhaps a chauffeur. I remember a man in grey tunic and trousers. Remember leaning against him. The EMV had a bubble top, polarized from the outside, but quite transparent from where we sat in deep cushions and looked out. I counted 1, 2 portals, and then we were out and away from the concourse and gaining altitude above blue fields under a yellow sky. Elaborate homes, made from some ebony wood, sat on hilltops surrounded by poppy fields and bronze lakes. Renaissance Vector? It was too difficult a puzzle to work on right then, so I laid my head against the bubble and decided to rest for a moment or two. Had to be rested for Lady Philomel's portrait. The countryside passed below. It does actually say "ha," comma space "ha" there. I'm not just inserting that for a giggle. All right, with that, I'm going to call it for this week. The countryside passed below, and our next bit will be it'll be another one of these the present tense ones where he's dreaming. So that's the start to The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons, the sequel to Hyperion, which we just got through. Hopefully people are digging it. Hopefully it wasn't too mangled by my recitation. We'll go from there. Hopefully subsequent ones will be a bit more energized as I get more energy, as opposed to where I am right now, which isn't energized. So we'll chip away. It's going to take a while for us to get through, since we're not going to be doing it twice a week, just once a week. To anyone tuning in after the fact, hi! I do these live. That's why they're rough.
really, really, really rough. Um, they're all, you're probably watching it on YouTube unless I've decided to change format sometime in the indeterminate future and have an actual something somewhere else. Anyway, you can catch me live every week on every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, um, where I read, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time or U.S. East Coast time. Um, on all three of those days, which I can't remember anymore. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Those are the ones. Yes, those. The odd days off. Those ones. Yep, those days. So yeah, that's it. That's how we're doing it. Um, Theoretically, my other streams are thematic. Mondays are Mecha Mondays, where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. This is the year of reading, and I'm reading uh, mecha related or adjacent reading material. Right now, we're about a third of the way through the Mobile Suit Gundam novelization by Yoshiyuki Tomino. Um, if you've ever watched that series, it's a bit different. It's a bit different. Anyway, and then Wednesdays, I'm going to keep reading through Radicalized, the short story collection by Cory Doctorow. And we'll get the second half of Unauthorized Bread next Wednesday. All right, barring tragedy that prevents it, I won't know until too late to inform anyone. So, whatever. Anyway, um, that's it for today. As always, stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. Alrighty, with that, I'm gonna scoodle. I got stuff to do. Um, and yeah, stay classy. Be cool. Enjoy life as best you can, unless it involves inflicting suffering on other people, in which case, fuck off and stop doing that. Thanks. Seriously, fuck you. You're a monster. Fuck off. Maybe eat glass. I don't know. Ground up into a fine, fine powder. It'll just be whatever. Deriving pleasure from human suffering is pretty fucked, and I'd prefer you not do it. Thanks. Schadenfreude is different than sadism, I swear. Probably. It's probably different. Anyway, now that I've made at least two people leave, bye, hi, it's fun. Um, yeah, I'm gone. Have fun. See y'all next week if I'm still alive, which I will be. I think I'm not in my fit. I'm in no fit state right now. I apologize. Hence the horror of those earlier statements just a minute ago. Anyway, see you all later. Bye. Hope you continue to enjoy despite my awfulness just a moment ago. And yeah, see you all later. Bye. Goodbye. I gotta hit the